Good afternoon and welcome back. You know, the achievement gap and that issue is one that comes up in just about every single educational conversation. How can we close that achievement gap? Not only does poverty play a role in the achievement gap, but we also know that geography and race can be factors as well. I have the honor now of introducing our next Ed Talk, a personal story of living through desegregation. Senator Joyce Elliott from Arkansas joins us next to share her personal story and how her childhood experiences led her to a better vision for America. Please join me in welcoming Senator Elliott to the stage.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for showing up. It would be difficult if this were an empty room. I really appreciate it. But I am a child of the 60s. I am a person who became deeply committed to desegregation when I was 15 years old. Next slide. So as I came upon this commitment, as I was thinking about what it means to be 15 years old and suddenly thrust into a situation that was not comfortable for me, I found my way through it, and I find myself thinking today, how is it that a 15-year-old could find her way through it? And today, sometimes as adults, we tend not to. This that you see is a replica of the Little Rock Nine. It's a statue, actually, of the Little Rock Nine that you probably know about, these 9 black students who simply wanted to go to school in an integrated setting and be educated. And like those students, I was a victim of the decisions of adults who made decisions that we should be divided. That's incredibly dangerous today when we live in a country that is incredibly more diverse than the ones you and I grew up in. I am an American. I chose this slide of the United States of America to remind us of how diverse we are, that we are not just predominantly black and white anymore. There are so many of us from so many places. I am a Southerner. I chose that Southern map because I decided as a youngster, as a Southerner, I am going to claim my South whether or not all of the indications I get say to me, you don't belong here. I decided that I did, and that it was going to be mine. I am also an Arkansan, an African-American woman who stands before you today, who actually represents the very high school, Central High School, that you see that beautiful picture of. This high school, where these 9 African-American students tried to go to school, resides in my district today. We call them the Little Rock Nine. It is not lost on us in Arkansas that because of race, we have something called the Little Rock Nine. And today, sadly, we have something called the South Carolina Nine because of race, because we have not dealt with it as we should. That picture you see at the bottom is a picture that informed my 6-year-old self in 1957 when I was 6 years old and starting to school. I was a precocious listener, which meant that I was always trying to figure out what the adults were talking about. And one of the things that I learned, sadly, was so much of their discussion was about race, the denial of opportunity, and the unfairness of it all. But this is how perverted race can have an effect on a child. I knew just enough to know about this, that students at Central High School had soldiers in order to go to school. And I knew I didn't like it. And I would ask, where are our soldiers? All of that because of decisions made by adults that would keep us apart, so we would have to have situations such as this, where these students had to have protection by an army of folks just to go to school. Next slide. So that's me. Yeah, I had hair. So just deal with it. I did. But because I had the experience of thinking about these students at Little Rock 9, I reflected on my own journey to think about how I got to be this person in this picture. So my young self that was going to school at 6 years old found herself 9 years later in the very same position as the Little Rock 9. I'd gone to an all-black school in the lower part of my county because all the black students were funneled into this one school. All of the white students had options. Choice before choice was cool. All of the white students had options because there were about 5 or 6 small white schools they could go to. In fact, we used busing to make sure that we maintain segregation. Busing to maintain segregation. Interesting, when we started to use it to tear down segregation, that's when it became controversial, isn't it? And I've always thought about that because my trip to school was about almost 2 hours. And there was an all-white school 3 miles from me that I was not allowed to go to because I was black. There was one family in our community who was Japanese. They went to the all-white school because you could go to the all-white school if you would just profess, please don't be black. You may come here. So in 1966, I found myself in the position as those kids at Central High School. Somebody had filed yet another facet of a lawsuit that said, and the judges said, no, we really aren't kidding. We do mean for you to integrate schools. And so a line was drawn around my family's home and about 4 others, and we were forced to go to this all-white school, Willisville School District. I, in fact, then was going to that school that was 3 miles from me. It was not pleasant. We were not welcomed. I didn't know until years later why I was less welcome than everybody else, but I was much less welcomed. A story I'll have to tell you in another setting. So now you'll have to talk to me when it's over. But that first year, we made it through. At semester, the principal and the superintendent of the district had all of the black students come to a meeting and said to us to our faces, we have in fact now integrated this district. You may go back to your schools next year, and we fully expect you to, because we don't want you here. And in fact, at that point, I'm thinking, there must be some real good reason you don't want me here, and I'm staying. I am staying. I was scared to death to even have that thought in my head because I was thinking, I hope everybody else is staying too. But they didn't stay, they weren't. In fact, they were relieved to be out of that situation, and I understand it. But my family was the only one who remained. And that is when I knew for sure, as that 15-year-old girl I referred to, I was absolutely committed to this notion of it is better for us to go to school together than not. Because I knew if these 2 men standing in front of me did not want us to go to school together, there was some reason of which I would not be proud later on. So I stayed. So in 1973, when I graduated with my afro-headed self, I was indeed excited about teaching, and there were many opportunities for me because so many school districts had not hired African-American teachers when more and more school districts were being integrated. I chose a school in the end who had never had a black teacher work in that school, and it was primarily because of the absolutely horrific and then sometimes much better opportunities I had had in a school where I was not welcomed, and eventually it got better. I knew what those kids were facing. I knew what it would have meant to me if I just could have seen one black somebody at this school. On the day I arrived, I drove up in my little Beetle, and I looked down the sidewalk, and there were all these black kids on steps together. So, being the person I was and thinking I'm here to make a difference. So I walked down and said hello to everybody. And when I walked down to them, they just stood up and gathered all around me. It was frightening. Suddenly, I felt the heavy load, the heavy need they had to have me there. And I thought, I don't know if I can do this. They expect so much and they need so much. But that was a short-lived thought, because I just remembered I had gotten through what happened to me at Willisville. I had gone to a college that was not exactly welcoming. I was pretty tough by then. But the wounds were still very raw. And you don't outgrow those wounds, by the way. They stay with you. It's what you choose to do with those wounds. But I also remembered very quickly, it was not just the black kids for whom I was there. It was for the white kids too, because they needed an opportunity to sit in a classroom with their black counterparts, taught by an African-American teacher, so that we could all prove to ourselves and everybody else, this is what a public school should be like, because the public school is preparing you for a world that does not look like your home in most cases. Next slide. So why then does it all matter? It matters because we did all of this work. The Little Rock Nine, Joyce Elliott, and so many others went through all of what it took to integrate our schools. And we did a pretty good job. But now we've gone back on all of that. We integrated, and now we have resegregated. And please don't reduce this conversation to something called political correctness, because that is what people do so many times when they don't want to talk about race. And it's unfair to the conversation, it's unfair to the reality, and it's unfair to our kids and our parents. It matters in so many ways today, because we are not the same world we were in the 70s and 80s when we really integrated our schools. It matters because young parents who are the mothers and fathers of kids like these really value diversity more than we did. Because in fact, many of those parents themselves are in households that don't look like yours and mine. And they want their schools to look like households that reflect their values and the people who are in their households and the world itself. I did some research and a little bit of reading on Richard Kahlenberg, and I like what he had to say about why public schools are important and what are their missions. And some of the things he said I think are important for us to even think about. So Richard Kahlenberg says, it matters because the point of public schools is to make sure that we have policies that will allow kids to learn how to live in a democratic society. He suggests that public schools are the places where we have an opportunity to have upward mobility, upward social mobility. But more importantly, it is the place where we will grow intelligent-minded, open-minded students who will know how to live in a world that is very diverse and know how to create cohesion. If they don't get that opportunity in school, when will they get that opportunity when they get out of school, and then it's a bit too late? You may go ahead a few slides and keep going. Right here, because I need to talk about this next. So if we don't have these kids with these opportunities, and they grow up and they become a part of the workforce, what happens, according to Richard Kahlenberg, is that employers spend about $200 to $300 million a year on cultural competencies that kids should have and could have learned in their public schools or any other schools for that matter, but they didn't learn it. They didn't have the opportunity because we are moving away from ourselves. A case in point, I will use my own city. Little Rock, where I live, the population is about 47% white, about 42% African American. And after that, we have the Hispanic population, that's about 6.11%. But after that, we have the Asian population, and then the population behind the Asians is a population of more than one race. That's how much we are changing. But my city has that reflection of who's in the city. But in our schools, our public schools are 66% African American and 19% white. That's a recipe for some problems, and we wonder why we have those problems. That did not happen in the 70s and 80s. We were so much better than that. And we have reverted to something and backed into our corners, and somehow, just by the attrition of not facing it, we act as if it's okay. So what do we do about this? We've traditionally put the burden not on our homes and not on our houses of worship, because our houses of worship are the places we tend to be the most segregated. We have traditionally put the burden on our schools and on the military. The military did it first. The military has done it well, and the military has not reverted to segregation. But our schools have. Now, policymakers in the room, what do we do about that? Other educators, or whoever you might be in the room, what do we do about that? So the question for you, is it okay? Are you okay with that? And I'm just going to assume the answer is no. So I want to suggest about 3 things to you I'd like you to consider. I'm sure there's more. But housing patterns, I think, is the #1 issue we need to consider. People will say they want neighborhood schools. They will say they want integrated schools, and the 2 things do not go together. We have the housing patterns that we have that lead to segregated schools because we have policies in place that have been there for decades and decades, and they're still there. And then we add more on top of those, and it creates a perfect recipe for segregated schools. And these are policies put in place by our government, state and federal. If you believe the mythology that we are not in integrated neighborhoods or integrated schools just because we don't want to be, that's exactly what you believe is mythology. It happened by design. It happened by intention. And if we're going to do anything about it, we have to act with intention. So for these housing policies, lest you think they still don't matter, just last week, the Supreme Court had to uphold the concept of disparate impact in Texas that will have ramifications all over, that we still may use disparate impact to make sure we don't have biases in housing. In 2015, that's still an issue. There's not time to talk about everything that happens with housing patterns, but the major thing I challenge you to do is learn the history of housing patterns and the laws that have undergirded them. Because if you unpack that, you will unpack, I'm sure, in a very big way, why we have segregated schools. And you can begin to think about what you can do about it. The second thing I would ask you to think about, we all give accountability and quality reports about our schools. Why don't we include in that the state of diversity in our schools? We almost never do. For example, if I'm one of those new parents and I'm looking at a school and considering that school, I promise you in almost every district across this country, they are not going to be able to know by looking at that school's website that Elliott Elementary School has this many kids in it who are of this color, or whatever the ethnicity. They might know that, but they won't know it in comparison to the makeup of the city itself or the neighborhood. For example, in Little Rock, there is not a single school that shows the demographics that I mentioned of the city compared to the demographics of the school. And parents want to know that. I don't want this conversation to get misconstrued that I'm saying that the only way kids can learn if they are side by side, by color, by ethnicity, or anything else. But I am absolutely saying to you, it matters a great deal. It's better for your child, it's better for my child. And it should be a part of the quality that we are thinking about in our schools and reporting it. The third and last thing I'd ask you to consider, something that I just call segregation impact statements. We do impact statements for all kinds of things. It would be nice, I think, and a good thing, if we looked at all of the housing policies and the other policies we put in place, if we learned by doing segregation impact statements, what has been the impact of these housing laws and other laws that we put in place on segregation? If we understand the impact, we know how to react to change things. We need to know that history. We should also subject our own laws that we pass from this point forward to segregation impact statements, whether it's about vouchers, whether it's about choice, whether it's about charter schools, whether it's about not having any of those things. What's the segregation impact? And in this day and age, it should be about race, ethnicity, and economics. Because I do recognize that in many places in our country, many times there may be a homogeneous population in a town. But there is no town where the population is homogeneous to the point that there is not economic disparity. That might be called, I don't know, heaven or someplace. It'd be nice. So these three things, in light of the experiences that I had, where I know I'm a better person because I had that opportunity, not just to learn academics in a school setting, but I learned about the social intellect that I needed to be a part of a diverse world. It is not going to happen that our world is going to revert to being less diverse. For my children, my grandchildren, and yours, we should take this reality and make sure they have a world when they are being trained to be a part of our democracy, and take positive steps to make sure our public schools are desegregated schools. And I would give the same challenge to schools that are not desegregated. It mattered for this 15-year-old girl who had this dream that we would go to school together and learn together. I still feel it as deeply today. Thank you.